Here is a question that might stop you in your tracks. Can you name the best-selling British family saloon of the 1950s, the car that outsold its glamorous sibling by a considerable margin, that was driven by doctors and salesmen and district nurses up and down every high street in Britain, and yet today struggles to fill a corner of any classic car show? You probably can. It is the Ford Consul. And the uncomfortable truth is this: more than 400,000 British families put their money down for one, making it one of Ford Dagenham's greatest commercial achievements of the entire decade. And yet ask almost anyone from that generation to close their eyes and picture a Ford from the early 1950s, and the odds are very strong they will describe the Zephyr 6. That is the puzzle at the heart of this story. One car sold in enormous numbers and quietly shaped the roads of post-war Britain, while another sold for considerably more money to considerably fewer people, and became immortal in the bargain. How does that happen? To understand it properly, you have to place yourself in Britain in the autumn of 1950. The war had been over for 5 years, but the austerity had not gone anywhere. Petrol rationing had only just been lifted that very year. Steel was still under government allocation. The cars sitting in British showrooms were, for the most part, warmed-over pre-war designs, upright, narrow, drafty things that felt as though they belonged to a different century entirely. A few manufacturers had taken tentative steps towards something more modern, but tentative is the right word. The standard Vanguard had arrived in 1948 with some American styling cues, and the Morris Oxford offered solid, dependable transportation, but neither of them looked like the future. They looked like the present, cautiously revised. And then, at the Earl's Court Motor Show, in October of 1950, Ford of England pulled the covers off, something that nobody in that audience had seen before, from a British manufacturer. 2 cars, a 4-cylinder and a 6-cylinder that looked as though they had been conjured from an American dream. Low rooflines, curved, sweeping bodywork, a wide, welcoming cabin. And beneath it all, an engineering solution so advanced that the industry would still be copying it half a century later. The 4-cylinder car was the Consul. The 6-cylinder was the Zephyr 6. They were twins in almost every respect, and yet from the very first moment the public laid eyes on them, one of them captured the imagination in a way the other never quite managed. This is the story of how that happened, and what it tells us about the difference between a car that is trusted and a car that is loved. Topic 1. The engineering revolution nobody talks about. Because what Ford of England launched at Earl's Court in October of 1950 was not simply a new car. It was a technical statement that rewrote the rulebook for the entire British motor industry, and the man who wrote that statement was an American engineer most people have never heard of. His name was Earl S. Macpherson, and he had been appointed chief engineer at Ford of England in 1949. Macpherson had spent years developing an idea for a radically simplified front suspension layout, one that combined the coil spring and the shock absorber into a single telescopic strut, mounting directly to the wheel hub. The genius of it was not just that it worked remarkably well. It was that it eliminated an enormous number of separate components, reduced weight, lowered the floor of the engine bay considerably, and freed up usable space on both sides of the car for the engineer to work with. When the Consul went on sale in 1951, it became one of the very first production motor cars in the world to use what we now call the Macpherson strut, a suspension arrangement that would go on to dominate the industry for the rest of the 20th century and well into the 21st. The next time you walk around a modern hatchback and glance at its front suspension, you are looking at an idea that was first proven in serious, large-scale production on a Ford built at Dagenham. That is a genuine piece of engineering history, sitting unacknowledged in every car park in the country. But that was not all the Consul brought to the table. It also arrived with unitary body construction, what we now call a monocoque. In an era when the majority of British saloons still sat on a separate ladder chassis with the body bolted on top, the Consul's body and structure were welded into a single, stressed unit. This made the car lighter, stiffer, quieter on rough surfaces, and more resistant to the kind of scuttle shake and body flex that plagued older designs on Britain's imperfect post-war roads. The engine was a 1,508 cubic centimeter overhead valve four-cylinder unit, producing 47 brake horsepower at 4,400 revolutions per minute. That figure will not set the pulse racing today, and nor should it. The Consul was not built for excitement. It was built for reliability, for reasonable economy, and for the practical demands of a family that needed to cover ground in genuine comfort without spending a fortune on either fuel or maintenance. The overhead valve layout was more efficient and significantly more accessible to service than the side valve engines that still powered several of its British rivals. Power went to the rear wheels through a 3-speed gearbox with a column-mounted gear lever, the arrangement known to everyone who lived through that era as 3 on the tree. The change itself was not crisp by any standard we would apply today, but it was learnable quickly, and it freed the entire front floor for passengers to sit without any intrusion from a central transmission tunnel. With the bench front seat that most Consuls were specified with, you could seat 3 across the front of the car, making it a genuine 6-seater by the working standards of the day. In period road tests, the Consul returned a top speed of approximately 76 miles per hour and covered the 0 to 60 acceleration run in around 26 seconds. In 1951, on British roads, with petrol rationing only just lifted, that was more than adequate for everything the overwhelming majority of buyers would ever ask of it. The styling carried a distinctly American flavor. Ford's design direction from Dearborn had influenced the overall proportions significantly, with the American stylist George Walker's team contributing to the program, but the dimensions had been carefully scaled for the narrower British road network and the notably more compact British garage. The result was a car that felt genuinely modern, almost startlingly so, when parked beside the upright pre-war survivors that still populated British streets in very large numbers. When sales began in earnest in 1951, the Consul arrived at a basic price of £595 before purchase tax. With purchase tax applied at the rates then in force, the on-the-road figure came to approximately £737. To put that in its full context, the average British annual wage in 1951 was in the region of £350 to £400. The Consul was asking nearly 2 years' wages from the average working family, and they paid it. Topic 2. The Zephyr's shadow. What the Consul was up against. Now we need to talk about the Zephyr 6, because to understand why the Consul became the forgotten half of this story, you need to understand precisely what it was sharing a showroom with, and precisely what made that comparison so quietly damaging to the Consul's long-term reputation. The Zephyr 6 used the same body shell as the Consul, the same doors, the same roof, the same McPherson strut suspension, the same monocoque floor and structure. Ford's engineers had stretched the nose of the car forward to accommodate an inline 6-cylinder engine of 2,262 cubic centimeters, producing 68 brake horsepower, 21 more than the Consul's 4-cylinder. The result was a top speed comfortably above 90 miles per hour, and a quality of progress that the Consul could not replicate. Smooth, effortless, almost turbine quiet at a fast cruise, pulling strongly from low revolutions, with the particular silkiness that a well-designed 6-cylinder engine delivers and that no 4-cylinder, however willing, can entirely fake. There was also a third variant in the range almost from the outset, the Zephyr Zodiac, which arrived in 1953. The Zodiac was a more lavishly appointed version of the Zephyr 6, with two-tone paintwork, richer interior trim, and a slightly elevated state of tune. It carried the range's aspirational ceiling right up to the edge of genuine executive territory and placed a clear distance, in the buyer's mind, between the Zephyr world and the Consul world. The Zephyr 6 cost considerably more than the Consul, approximately £890 on the road in 1951, with purchase tax applied, and it carried itself accordingly. It was a car that a successful solicitor might drive, a regional sales director, a man who had done well and wanted the world to appreciate that fact in a manner that remained within the bounds of good taste. And then came 1953, the Monte Carlo Rally, even then, one of the most demanding and most glamorous motorsport events in the calendar, was won outright by a Ford Zephyr 6. The driver was the Dutch privateer Maurice Gatsonides, who would later become famous in an entirely different context as the inventor of the Gatso speed camera. Gatsonides drove his Zephyr across treacherous alpine stages and winter roads to take the top prize overall. The result was reported enthusiastically throughout the motoring press on both sides of the channel, and it confirmed something that buyers instinctively already felt. The Zephyr 6 was the exciting one. It was the car that could go anywhere and beat anyone. It had proven it on one of the hardest roads in European motorsport. The Consul never had a Maurice Gatsonides. The Consul never won Monte Carlo. The Consul was being driven by your family doctor on his rounds and by your uncle on his way to the office, while the Zephyr was crossing the Alps in the hands of a racing hero. That distinction, forged in the mountains of France and Monaco in the winter of 1953, opened a gap in public perception that the Consul never managed to close. However reliable it was, however well engineered, however sensibly priced, the Consul would always be the car that stayed home while its brother went adventuring. The Mark I Consul ran from 1951 through to 1956, during which time Ford of England built approximately 229,000 examples. In 1956, the entire range was restyled and re-engineered as the Mark II, and the Consul received a larger 1,703 cubic centimeter engine producing 59 brake horsepower, a wider and more substantially restyled body with more pronounced rear fins, a broader grille, and a more comfortable interior. The Mark II Consul ran until 1962 and accounted for approximately 209,000 additional cars. Total Consul production across both generations came to more than 430,000, a figure that tells you everything about how deeply British families trusted it, and nothing at all about whether they found it romantic. Topic 3: Z cars, everyday life, and why the Zephyr won the cultural argument. There is a date that matters enormously in this story, and it is the 2nd of January, 1962. On that evening, the BBC broadcast the first episode of a new police drama called Z Cars. The series was set in a fictional new town on the outskirts of Liverpool, and it followed the officers of the Z Victor Patrol, named for the radio call sign prefix assigned to their vehicles by the fictional force. Those vehicles were Ford Zephyrs. The show was raw, realistic, and deliberately unlike the polite, undemanding police dramas that had preceded it on British television. The officers were complicated, sometimes flawed people, living ordinary lives under pressure, and those Ford Zephyrs, long-nosed, purposeful, filling the frame of the television screen as they turned hard through wet, northern streets, became as much a part of the program's identity as any of its cast members. They were not props, they were characters. Over the following years, as Z Cars became one of the most watched and most discussed programs in British broadcasting history, the Zephyr became embedded in the national consciousness in a way that no motor show appearance or sales achievement could ever have secured for the Consul. Every week, millions of British families watched those cars at work. The Zephyr was modernity in motion. The Zephyr was authority, capability, and a slight hint of menace, all qualities that looked very well on a television screen in a British living room at 7:30 in the evening. Z Cars ran in various forms until 1978. An entire generation grew up watching Zephyrs, and the association between that car and a certain vivid idea of post-war Britain became effectively permanent. Ask a British man who grew up in the 60s to describe a police car from his childhood, and more often than not, he will describe a Zephyr, not because he necessarily saw one on the road, because he saw one on television every week for years. The Consul, meanwhile, was doing what it had always done, carrying families quietly and reliably from one destination to another, accumulating mileage in the service of fleet operators, company car schemes, and traveling representatives, serving as the unacknowledged workhorse of Middle England with complete reliability and not a single moment of drama. In this it was, paradoxically, a victim of its own considerable virtues. It did its job so competently and so undemonstratively that there was nothing to hold on to in memory, nothing to remember vividly, nothing to put on a poster. Let us be fair to the Consul and consider what those 430,000 buyers were actually receiving in return for their money. Mechanically, they were getting something genuinely modern for its time, one of the first widely available British cars with independent front suspension and unitary construction, an accessible overhead valve engine that responded reliably to straightforward servicing, and interior space and ride comfort that compared very favorably to anything else at the price. Fuel economy was reasonable by the era's standards. The Mark I typically returned between 28 and 32 miles per gallon in normal driving, which mattered greatly to buyers who had only recently been freed from years of rationing. What the Consul gave you was confidence. Confidence that it would start on a cold morning, complete the journey, and prove that your money had been well spent. That is not a small thing in 1951 Britain, with money still tight. That kind of confidence was precisely what most families needed, but it is not glamour. It does not fill a page in a classic car magazine with longing. One further honesty must be offered about both cars. Rust was a very serious problem as they aged. The unitary body construction, that was such a genuine advance in 1951, became a liability over the following decades. Once the sills, floor sections, and inner wing areas began to corrode as they inevitably did in British weather, repairs were expensive, technically demanding, and structural in nature. Vast numbers of Consuls were scrapped through the 1970s and 1980s, as repair costs exceeded any practical valuation of the car. The result is that genuinely well-preserved, original Consul examples are today considerably rarer than the production figures might suggest. In today's classic car market, a fully restored Mark I or Mark II Consul, in excellent condition, has achieved prices in the region of £10,000 to £15,000 at specialist auction, with particularly documented or original examples occasionally surpassing that. So here is where we arrive, at the end of this particular road. The Ford Consul was, by any objective measure, a genuinely remarkable achievement. It brought advanced engineering to the British family car market, at a price and on a scale that no competitor in its class could match in the early 1950s. Its McPherson strut suspension was a legitimate first that permanently changed the industry. Its unitary body construction pointed a direction that every serious manufacturer eventually followed. And its sales figures more than 430,000 cars across 11 years and 2 distinct generations of the model speak to a level of public confidence that cannot be manufactured by reputation alone. It had to be earned, mile by mile, winter by winter, family by family. But confidence is not the same thing as romance. The Zephyr 6 won Monte Carlo in 1953. The Zephyr starred in Z Cars from 1962 and became part of the fabric of British television. The Zephyr had that silky 6-cylinder engine and a top speed that made the roads feel pleasingly inadequate. The Zephyr had a story with heroes in it, with drama and speed, and a television program that played it in every living room in the country. The Consul just had a very good record. And when memories are being formed and reputations decided for posterity, a compelling story beats an impeccable record almost every single time. The Consul did what the very best working cars have always done. It served faithfully, without fuss, and then slipped quietly from the collective memory as the world moved on. It is the kind of car that the men and women who actually owned one remember with genuine, uncomplicated affection, and that everyone else has forgotten entirely. If you drove a Consul, or if your father or uncle kept one on the drive, we would love to hear your memories down in the comments. What was it like to live with? What did it do well, and what drove you to distraction? And if you are among the dedicated few who own one today, please tell us about it, because every one of those 430,000 cars represents a real family and real history that deserves to be remembered. If this video has been worth your time, a like goes a long way in helping us reach an audience that cares about stories like this one. And if you want to see more history covering the cars and the people and the moments that shaped the roads of Britain and America in the post-war decades, then subscribing is the simplest way to make sure nothing gets past you. Thank you genuinely for watching. These are your cars and your history. It is a privilege to talk about them with you.